Hi, everybody. This is Tara Bradley with The Growth State, and I am super excited to have my friend and colleague, Jarrod Heinz, on today. He is a seasoned CFO. He cut his teeth in the startup world and has taken several companies to scale and shepherded their transactions. He's bootstrapped, he's raised with angels, he's gotten VC funding, PE funding, acquired companies, been acquired. He's pretty much seen it all. And he's my favorite kind of CFO. He can dig into the operations piece. He's a great janitor and really, really good practical jokes. So he is the guy you want on your team. So Jarrod, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Tara. Glad to be here.
I start all of these interviews with the same question, and yours is a little bit interesting because a lot of the people that I think go down the entrepreneurial path and start businesses, they kind of had this pain point where they took a pivot and said, hey, I don't want to do that, or I can solve a problem that was really painful for me, and I'm going to do that. Your situation's a little bit different because you've always kind of been in that startup world, or you got in it maybe by default and have stayed there. I know you've had plenty of pain points, but can you think back in time to like a defining moment where you're like, hey, I bring something to the table that's a little bit different than normal CFOs, and I want to stay down this really entrepreneurial path, which a lot of people in your kind of role don't often do?
Yeah, I probably started early on in probably college when people would ask me what what I was going to get my degree in, and I say accounting, and they'd kind of look at me cross-eyed because my personality probably doesn't fit the accounting world. And I kind of got accounting degree because I was somewhat good at it, and then I ended up passing the CPA exam, and then wanted to get some experience in the CPA world, and did that for about 4 or 5 years, and it was clearly not for me. I wanted to be part of a company. I wanted to be part of a private company that was growing, and I left public accounting, went to private accounting, or to a private industry that was bigger. And then I got a call from a friend of mine saying he was had a job for me at this little startup called DocuTap in 2006, and that was probably the pivotal moment when I joined DocuTap. That's when I thought, oh man, this is fun. There's nothing more fun than being part of anything really that's growing, whether it's a company or I've got 4 kids, so helping my family grow. Anything that's growing and moving forward is exciting for me. I realized when I started with DocuTap. So I'm always drawn towards organizations or anything that really has a focus on growth.
Perfect. That's why you're here on The Growth State.
That's what I
love it. So talk to me about this. I feel, and I think a lot of the people that are watching this feel like their first really, really grown-up decision that they make when they realize that, hey, I've got something here it's got legs and we're going to be able to grow it. And we've got to kind of mature. The first thing they think of is fiscally, and it's usually the thing they're not great at. So like our first kind of grown-up decision as a founder, CEO, that kind of leader is, what am I going to do for a CFO? What do I need in that space? And you've been there and you've seen that process a few times. If they're thinking about that and thinking, I've got to go out and get this awesome CFO that can do, what you've done is help them grow the company and be really forward thinking, what are they looking for? And where's a great place to find those resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think adaptability obviously is probably number one. Be able to roll with the punches. A lot of people whose brains think like mine do, well, probably none think like mine do. That'd be kind of scary. But it's like A plus B equals C, and in any, especially a startup company, A plus B does never equal C. It's always changing. And we at DocuTap early on, we made the joke, and this is probably not original with us, but that we were DocuTap years were like 7 years, like dog years, because things change so quick. So if you don't like change, then you shouldn't grow. You shouldn't work at a startup company for sure, and especially in that role of be in a position like I was, or I am in, which is a CFO, you've really got to be able to roll with it and be able to pivot quickly. You got to be able to do everything. When I first started at DocuTap, I mean, I was everything, and 2008 happened and the world stood still. And I literally, Tara made a joke earlier, I was the janitor for a while, cleaning out a Roomba that we had because we fired our janitorial staff. We didn't fire them, we just couldn't afford to pay them.
Fired
So
sounds
it's
better.
just adaptability. Yes,
Yeah.
fired. Yeah, adaptability is got to be number one, and then kind of being able to kind of do two things at the same time, which is see the big picture, but then know that kind of the devil's in the details. So being able to not get, to be able to see the forest through the trees, but then also to be able to kind of see the trees as you go along. Those are super important, really important. And then I'd say the next thing is just be able to operationally dive in and figure out and try to help people think about, like, okay, if we hire 3 people or 2 people or even 1 person, depending on your size, what does that do to the long range forecast? I think a lot of times, especially in the software world where it's recurring revenue, it takes a while to build that recurring revenue up. So you can't just go hire 10 people because you get paid over time. And so you've really got to step into that. And I think the CFO is one that has to be able to look out there and really get all the management team members running the company on the same page as, okay, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to bootstrap this thing? Are we trying to not take VC money? Or, hey, are we just trying to grow as fast as we can? And then, revenue, and then we'll think about cash, because it's completely different strategies. So getting everybody aligned on that is also very important, and kind of having the personal ability to, or the personality, or, kind of, because a lot of times you're managing a lot of different personalities and a lot of different just goals, and trying to, and I think the CFO is one that can kind of see that as a broadly, and be able to bring that those people together.
Yeah. And
did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's
I don't know.
perfect. I think one
Okay.
of the things that Jarrod has done incredibly well in the companies that I've worked with him with is he also has the ability to lead teams that aren't essentially finance teams, right? It's like, hey, I know I'm an early hire. We have some gaps in our leadership team as we build out, an executive team or a senior leadership team. And so you were able to wear hats. I think that's really critical. If your CFO is your first hire, they've got to be able to run some of those other teams too, until you can afford to bring in that other talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
You mentioned bootstrapping, which you've done sometimes by necessity, right? Sometimes by choice. You've seen VC, you've seen private equity, you've been bought, you've sold. What's your favorite kind of environment to be in? What's the one that you're most comfortable with and you're like, gets you super excited?
I do think that just as long as something's growing, and I can feel like I'm a key to that growth, that's really kind of where I really want to land. The early stages of a company, like startup mode, like pre-revenue or right at early revenue, like that's when you're waking up every day and you have no idea what's going to happen. That was exciting early on at DocuTap, but also super stressful. I mean, we were at the end of our rope, I don't know how many times, and you just kind of got used to it. But I think probably my favorite is when you're like, oh my gosh, I think we actually have something here. And then you're like, okay, how do we actually scale this? And that's when the decision comes is, okay, we have something, we know we have something, the market's saying, yes, I will pay for this. And you're making a difference, and you're growing, and you're helping your clients grow too, which is fun. And you can see the product that you're selling is in there helping, and then you're just trying to think about, okay, how do we go out and help more clients? In our case at DocuTap and Vitalware, it was in the medical side. So how do you help them? How do you help patients? So that's probably the most exciting, is when you're just so, like, in there trying to figure out, once you know you have something. Before you know you have something, it's kind of like, oh gosh, I hope we're not just like on a rat wheel here.
Right.
Yeah, so that's probably the most fun for me.
That's awesome. So I know you've done early stage. I know that you've gotten in, as companies are just starting to scale and get organized and think about scalability. When you come in at that kind of later stage where they've got a team, they've got some decent sales, and they're like, okay, now how do we accelerate this? What do you, as a CFO, if you're new to that organization and they maybe haven't been super fiscally mature, what are you looking for first? What is the thing that's like, hey, I need to find some clues that tells me where we're really at, so I understand the end, and what do I have to do to help get us there?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably number one is just come in and figure out, hey, what are we selling? Do we know what we're selling? It's startup companies are notorious for, hey, we've got 37 different things we're selling, but really only maybe 2 or 3 of them have taken off, yet we have this like price book of 37 different things. So trying to help bring some focus to, okay, let's get focused on what we're selling. I mean, there's a reason why Apple's the most valuable company in the world. They sell like one thing. So bringing some focus, and using numbers to do that, using facts. I had a guy on our board at DocuTap, Kevin Lynch, who's a great guy. He said to me, which is great advice, I haven't forgotten, it's like the CFO needs to be the fact guy. So no emotions, just come in fact, and if you already spent $1 million on this product and it's not going to work, don't throw good money after bad money. So I think coming in and doing that as kind of level setting there, and then looking at, okay, what's sales look like? What's the pipeline look like? Is it real? Is it a real pipeline? Is it just so you can get some sort of idea on what the next year or two is going to be, and then you can start kind of working back from there and just saying, what can we actually do from how much cash do we have, and then getting out a plan, and then more in the details is, hey, are we tracking the right metrics? Do we have the right, accounting books in order? Are we doing things the right way? And then kind of beyond the normal metrics that you'd see in a financial statement of what is a SaaS-based company, getting monthly dashboards to have kind of like lagging indicators of how the company is doing, and then hopefully some leading indicators with the pipeline and where are we going to be, just to get in a cadence. I think that's where if you're not focused on the financial side, you can look up 6 months and be like, hey, how in the world do we get here? And if you have just somebody, it both giving you kind of a roadmap financially, and then also some gates every month to just say, okay, here's the roadmap, here's where we're at. Are we good? Are we bad? And again, just being the fact guy is important to a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I've definitely found that, and being the COO or the other executive leader who's doing that can be really frustrating, because you're, blood, sweat, and tears every day trying to get this thing going. And here you've got the CFO who's no emotion, right? And just bringing the facts. And Jarrod does it really well. I can remember a few times where, we were getting really amped up and he's like, well, you've only made this much money on it and you're not going to, should we really do it? And you're like, oh yeah, makes sense. Good idea. Let's talk about KPIs, metrics. So you're going in, looking to scale, and let's just say it is a transaction you're looking for, whether it's, selling the company outright, VC, PE, whatever. What are the KPIs that 2 or 3 that you feel like are the most important financially to really pay attention to as you scale?
Well, number one is just as you scale is, what's your cash burn, and then how much runway you have. That's got to be number one. At DocuTap in particular, we were, we had a cash that we did almost every day for a while, just to make sure that we were on pace. Because that's the last thing you want to make sure you live to like survive the next day. You can't have this great product and great market fit and great team and all these things, and all of a sudden you look up and you're like, hey, we're out of cash. And so that's what I've learned, the hard way a few times. That's got to be number one, is cash. And then after that, it's what's your goals? If you're looking for if there's a transaction and you're wanting to raise some VC money, then that runway is important. And then what's your revenue? What's your revenue growth? And so financially, those are some key metrics. What's your annual revenue, your MRR? What's your churn? Churn is super important. What's your net retention? So do you have an upsell strategy? All of those things are really important as you're looking for a transaction or some sort of exit. And it's always helpful if you can do that and still be cash flow kind of break even. So those are probably the key metrics that me as a CFO I'm looking at. And then also, I haven't said anything about just culturally how important culture is to a company that's starting, and I mean that usually hits your finances really hard if the culture isn't great, and it has to be great for a startup company. And that, to me, that boils down to, do you trust the people you work with? Do you like working with them? Do you trust them? Because when you're at a startup company, it's usually not glamorous. It's usually not what you see on TV. It's usually cleaning out a Roomba twice a month and getting sick from it. So it may be 15 years after, but it's not when you're in it. And so you've got to like the people you work with. You got to trust the people you work with. And there's a book out there called I think it's called The Speed of Trust. That is a really good just indicator that your business grows as fast as you trust the people you work with. And I have lived that and learned that. I think that's so true. That's why I like working with Tara.
Yeah, we have a good time. I want to shift gears a little bit because you've been through the diligence process a few times. Feels like that's all we do sometimes. But I think what people don't often realize when they're building out their team and that CFO is their first strategic hire, if they're looking for a transaction, he's the guy that's likely going to QB diligence. So, he's going to quarterback it. He's going to make sure everybody's on point. You can put a whole deal team together, but ultimately he's kind of the point guy. If, some of the people watching this is their first time going into that process or a deal process at all, how do they, if they are the CFO, how do they get prepared for that process? And if they're not, as a CEO and leader, how do you help them get ready for that? Because it's all encompassing, plus your day job, and you really have to have a mind to what comes next. And so I'd love to get your perspective on how do you prepare for that if you've never done it?
Yeah, number one is you just got to make sure your data is right. Because there's nothing worse. And again, I've probably learned the hard way here, is you get into a meeting or you throw some data over to a potential buyer and they come back and say, hey, this data doesn't make any sense. So there's a credibility factor there. And so especially if you're new to organization, that you have a transaction probably upcoming in the next year to 3 years. Right away, you got to make sure that your data is right. And then you get into consistent rhythm of making sure that data is right, just on an ongoing basis. And then, I've always tried to run things like, hey, I got to pretend like next month there's a buyer coming in and they want to start due diligence. And so what are the things that we need to make sure are in line prior to that happening? And one is just, your financials have to be in order, meaning you got to have a GAAP financials ready to go. You've got to have your metrics that I talked about earlier, and over time, sales pipeline is super important. Make sure that you get in a cadence with making sure your sales pipeline, so someone doesn't come and ask, and then you spend 2 weeks trying to get a sales pipeline. And so I've always thought, okay, if someone comes tomorrow and asks, what's your information from the last month and how quickly can I get it to them? And it's got to be quick. That's another thing I think in a transaction that just proves to a buyer that you know what you're doing, which is it's the data is right and it's quick and it's timely. So that's really important. So if you're in an organization where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where I'd start at the basics. Make sure your financials, make sure your KPIs are up to date, make sure your pipeline. And then beyond that, it's just really important when you get into the other stuff, depending on your scale, you know, HR things can trip up. You know, make sure you got all your everything kind of buttoned up on the HR side. And then also on all the contracts you have. I mean, just make sure you get everything in order, get it digitally so you can share them really quick. Again, I think that the speed of turning stuff around is really important in any transaction, and just provides confidence to the buyer that you know what you're doing. And I think, did I answer your question? I think that was the question.
No, I think it's perfect.
Okay.
One of the things, Jarrod and I have done this a few times, and there's a reason. It's because we love it. We love to grow companies. And one of the very first things that we do and we communicate when we come in is say, hey, if a transaction is what you're looking for, you need to be in a defensible position. We've got to evaluate where you're at as a business. Organizationally doesn't make sense. And then we have to be in a defensible position. And that means having systems in place, having documentation, audits, all of those things. You don't have to have them all out of the gate, but if you know you're imminently going to have a transaction, you may as well start talking about it and verbalizing it with your senior leadership team so they can get organized, because it's true. The quicker you can turn that stuff around, the more trust that you build with whoever's looking at you. They want to believe your story. They want to love your team. And if they've done those things and they trust that what you're giving them is real because you didn't have to go manufacture it, you're in that much better position. And so I think that's a huge, huge, huge piece of advice.
I think, Tara, the other thing that I would add is, you know, like, you're not perfect. No company's perfect. Everybody has their kind of warts that they have. And so, you know, it's just, and a buyer knows that. And so I just found that being transparent about those things, if somebody says, hey, we really need this piece of information, and you've given them 90% of what they want and it's good, and it's that, then they know that they can trust you because, hey, I'm a trustworthy person, but hey, this 10% over here, we don't have it. And the reason we don't have it is because X, Y, and Z. That's no big deal. But if you say that about 80% of the stuff that they're talking about, or even 50%, that's not a good situation. So if you can get most of it wrapped up, but you don't have to be perfect, and you can just say, hey, we don't have that, or gosh, we have this, but you know, this is kind of one of the things we're really working on. But you have a plan, and you know, it's important that as the seller, you identify what those are before the buyer comes and asks you the question about it. You got to wait for the right time to say it, but I think that's really important too, and that just lends to the credibility.
That's huge, because the first thing I'll tell you about diligence, if you've never been through it, if you make something up, they will find it. It's unlikely that you're going to slide it through. That's why they pay people a lot of money to come in and dig in if they don't know anything about it. And so there's no shame in saying, I don't know. I can go figure it out, or we're just not there yet. And we know that, and that's something that we're building too.
Yeah.
So. One of the things that you have done, and I've seen you do a few times, is you've had to actually build out a team too that could support some of that. Is if you're thinking about scaling a company, and let's just say you're at 10 million in revenue, growing at 40%, and you're just not quite profitable yet. Like, you got to make some investment. You still got to build a team because you're generating, you know, a decent amount of revenue. What do you focus on, and what kind of team is important to you to have behind you, so that we can, that whoever is doing it can get to the finish line in the right way?
Yeah. You're talking just a finance,
yeah.
team in particular. Yeah. Okay. I mean, a good, strong controller is really important. I mean, that is like really important. As if you're early on in the DocuTap world, I was controller, CFO, janitor, all those things. Sales and marketing leader for a while, which is kind of funny.
Best job ever.
But yeah, but having a strong controller, that was a key hire for me when I hired a strong controller, Travis Finnis. That was key. Then I could get more out of the details and start actually helping think about more strategically where we were going, what we were doing. That was a key hire. Having a real good HR team, and not only from just culturally. A lot of times people think HR, people operations, is a culture thing. Culture starts at the top. The executive team should be the cultural leaders. I don't think there's such thing as like a culture king or culture queen. It's that everybody's culture, they can help drive it. HR, people operations can kind of help and give people opportunities, but it's really an executive function. But the blocking and tackling of HR, making sure you've got legally everything kind of in order, that's a key, because that can take a lot of time. And if you have somebody who can just kind of get stuff done, that's a good thing. And we had a great one, Jen Schaefer at DocuTap, that helped with that immensely. And then I think having probably about that stage is when also having a good kind of analytics person, like an FP&A person, if you can afford it, that's kind of probably right at that $10-15 million, at least in my opinion, kind of. I mean, I can do the FP&A, I always say, but I don't do it efficiently, and I'm probably not that great at it, but I can kind of hack my way through it. But have somebody who just wakes up every day thinking, okay, what are some metrics of the company that we can have some data that actually backs up what decisions are being made. I'm a firm believer that data shouldn't necessarily drive decisions, especially at that stage of the company. It's a lot of times gut feel, but if you have data to back it up, it makes it even better. And then if you have the data that doesn't back it up, well, then you have a decision to make. Do I trust the data or I trust my gut? But then at least you know. And so having, again, that data, and then that's so important. That data person is so important when you get into diligence as well, because they're the ones who are making sure that a lot of that data is actually correct and up to date. And so again, it just breeds confidence to a buyer. And so those are probably, at least on the teams that I've seen, and then I'd probably say just having some legal help too. It's like you can get yourself into really costly situations if you don't have legal. And we had, great. Again, both the companies I was at, we had some great outside counsel that helped that. But those are probably the biggest things when you get to that stage.
Awesome. So controller, HR, analytics, and some outside counsel you can lean on. I can vouch for all of them. Analytics probably the most, because I had the most interaction. I mean, it gives you the opportunity to test theories too. You're like, let's test this. Let's know how to measure it, and then let's see if it proved out. And I think that's huge. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you one last question. You've done, I want to say 100 different deals. It feels like 1,000, but a lot. If you think back to, some of the deals that you've done, we all have great stories, but is there anything that you're like, man, if I personally, as a CFO and owner of kind of the financial ship, would have made a different decision, I feel like we could have come out in a better spot, as you look to a transaction that you tell people could be really common, they want to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably making sure that a buyer is educated up front, and the story that they're hearing from you is, well, it's not a story, it's accurate, but you're painting the right picture of either how your revenue works, or a buyer, whether it's a publicly traded company that's buying a private equity or VC, or any buyer is looking at, I don't know what the stats are, it's crazy, right? 1,000 deals, they end up buying one of them.
Right.
It's like 0.1% they end up actually buying. And it's like probably less than 2% they actually dig in on. And so they're looking at a ton of deals. So they don't necessarily know your business. And when you've been eating, sleeping, breathing that business for so long, it's important just to kind of simplify it and make it simple. And I think that was probably an error in one of the deals we tried to get done, is we probably skipped over too much of the simple of just really making sure that you're spelling it out just in black and white exactly how you bill, how you do, how your finances work, how the model works is really important. That was probably a big learning early on. I think we probably had people that passed on some things that were probably really good buyers and would have been really fun to work with, but we either overwhelmed them with information or we skipped that part. So I think that's probably one of my biggest learnings. And when you get in there, just drink a lot of coffee. That's probably the second one.
It's definitely. And I want to emphasize what you said though, because that revenue model piece is huge. And one of the things that we do in startups is we try to sell all the things to all the people and hit everybody. And one of the first things that gets diluted is your rev model, right? Are we services? Are we recurring revenue? Is it a subscription fee? Is it, yearly? And it confuses your team. It confuses your consumer, and it confuses those that could be looking for a transaction. So I think that's a huge, huge piece of advice.
Yep.
Have one, keep it simple, keep it consistent. You do that early on, that picture will paint itself, particularly if you're growing in a really organic and, and transparent way. Awesome. Well, we're out of time, Jarrod. Thank you so much for doing this. Okay. I know this isn't
thanks, Sarah.
Typical wheelhouse, but I love that you came on and shared all of your knowledge with us.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.